Thanks, Rob, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for being here. I hear today's sessions were very informative and focusing on a very important aspect of wildlife and a very worthy cause. This was a tough book to write. I wrote it for my late wife, Pippa. Inspirational championing of wildlife itself. I wrote it in part for me because it's not so much that I bonded or loved wildlife like Heather did, but I hated what was being done to them, and I hated the hypocrisy and the mindlessness and the insensitivity that characterised wildlife. So what I wrote was controversial because I went after a belief system that's 2,000 years old. I went after it because I think it's wrong. And as long as it prevails, I see no other trajectory for wildlife in this country, or anywhere else for that matter, for wildlife and biodiversity, but downward. It's not that I think that wildlife managers and the individuals carrying out their job are remiss. I don't. I think in most cases they are well-meaning, dedicated professionals who do their job dutifully and with good intent. What I do contest are the beliefs that underpin what they do. That I do contest. That they don't contest them, I'm not surprised. When you've got a belief system that's 2 centuries old, 2 millennia old, then change is going to be very, very difficult. In fact, I think the price of change is too high. I think you've got to give up too much. I think it's too high. But nevertheless, I felt constrained to write the book because of Heather and of me. I remember when I was teaching a class way back, we were discussing the fact that a black bear was shot out of a tree in Okotoks and he was doing nothing, sitting in the tree. And we discussed it, the kids and I, with the various ramifications. You know, what was the bear doing and what was the policy and who was protesting, and the usual things that kids discuss. And at the end, the little guy got up and his face was twisted in pain and he was crying and he said, "Why?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to go into it. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell him that human self-interest dominates every wildlife policy. Wildlife policy, more about humans than wildlife. Sad to say, but I believe it. I also think that wildlife policy is carried out with the belief that animals are extinctual things with no claim to morality, no claim to anything. And on these two beliefs, I think, foreordain the subjugation of wildlife. I could finish a darn lecture right here, right now. I've said it. Human self-interest and a belief that wildlife are neutered things. You can date, I think that the human relationship with animals and wildlife is no more than a set of rationalizations that hide a power, that hide a power relationship. Humans can and do subjugate wildlife, but it's rationalized. Greek thought, I think, is the first serious platform for these rationalizations. Aristotle. Not like Aristotle. I think he was tougher on wildlife than he wanted to be. If you read some of Aristotle, you realise that he's not as bad as he sounds. But he did say that wildlife existed for people, and that wildlife and animals had no reason, lacked the faculty of reason, the crucial determining factor, lacked language, couldn't communicate, lacked any sense of belief, any concept of their own mortality, any sense of volition at all. And that suited the belief system. And the Catholic Church jumped all over it and said, yep, we'll go with that. And Aristotle's Augustine came to the fore, but Augustine was not as good as Aristotle, not in his league. But he said virtually the same thing. That it's somehow a supreme being likes us. It doesn't like anything else. It likes it, but not really. I was taught that growing up. Catholic school. If God really likes us. That God, yeah, he doesn't mind animals, but not really. They're not going to go to heaven like you. There's no immortal soul. Powerful combination. Aristotle and Augustine. Right up there. In 1978, a future justice of the Supreme Court in Canada, talking about an animal cruelty case, made a comment about man's superior status in nature, and it was his role, when he had to, was to subjugate animals and do whatever we can to them in the natural order of things. 1978. No Stoic could have said that better. No Stoic philosopher could have said that better. Not Epictetus, not Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, none of them. That was pure Stoicism. 1978. Hadn't learned a darn thing. And as far as the Catholic Church goes, Second Vatican Council, 1965, said man is the only creature that God has created for its own sake. 2,000 years later. No change. But that's wrong. Wrong. Animals do reason. It's verifiable. Animals do communicate. Donald Griffin showed us that. Animals communicate in their own language. Animals do have ethological research in the field is showing that animals do have conscious states. They do have subjective experiences that belong only to themselves. They do exhibit higher order consciousness, a sense of justice and fairness and cooperation. Research has shown that. Wildlife management policies in Canada behave as those didn't even exist. Didn't exist. Don't even exist. They're still steeped in Stoic thought, Aristotelian thought, and Catholic theology. In fact, I think that wildlife managers are still steeped in what the British behavioural psychologist Lloyd Conway Morgan said in the mid-1860s. This is rich. In no instance can an action by an animal be accorded coming from a high psychical frame when a low psychical one is feasible. In other words, translated into real practice, that means because animals can't speak to us and tell us their feelings, then it's okay for us to say they've got none. Why do you think animal experimentation went through so easily in the first half of the 20th century? Why factory farming so popular? Didn't matter. Not dealing with living things, living beings. He did it with the things. And Descartes went even further. Descartes said things that aren't even things. He was really bad. And yet I suppose you can make an argument that no matter how good we are, animals are, we a bit better. You can make that argument. I can buy that. But wildlife management is not a conservation issue. It's not a management issue. It's moral. It's a moral issue. Wildlife management should be moral, and there's no morality to it. The only modification in the belief system came in the form of David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, and then a couple of centuries later, Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher, although Bentham was no Hume. And Hume pointed out that the root of our moral feelings, the way we treat each other, the values we ascribe to us, ourselves and to others, things like compassion and empathy and understanding and right and wrong, and the way we should behave towards each other, that's not rooted in reason, it's not rooted in higher order consciousness, and it's not rooted in language. It's rooted in emotion. The heart, not the mind. Morality is rooted in emotion. And Hume said it should extend to other creatures. And Bentham's famous footnote, not can they reason, it's can they suffer. Yet, on the basis of, it's just wrong to say that animals have no experiences that belong to them. You've got your pets, you know that. How can you say that? Because once you say that animals have feelings that belong to them, animals have experiences that belong to them, then you've got to say, you are a moral being. Wildlife management can't say that. Can't go that far. Because once you say they're a moral being, you open the bloody floodgates. And that's not the way. Oh, by the way, these are my arguments. I'm not saying that they're God-given anymore. I'm saying that in my belief system, it's not a matter of reason or a matter of language. It's a matter of animals being moral beings, and we should treat them morally. The only moral claim animals have on us is that you're not cruel to them. And I read an article by the IFAW studying cruelty laws in several countries, the readers. And I said, no, I won't. I won't do it. I said, I'll shorten the philosophy part, and I'll shift it to the introduction, but I won't get it out of there. If not, I walk. I go somewhere else. I cannot attack a belief system unless I tell the reader how the belief system came to be. And I said, okay, we like it, so we'll do that. So I won that battle. Okay, how are wildlife subjugated? First of all, the human interest. It's everywhere. Let me look at the Species at Risk Act. Let me look at the Species at Risk Act. That we do not list the polar bear as threatened, let alone endangered. SARA, the Species at Risk Act, the government, when I say SARA, I mean the Species at Risk Act, and I mean the government. SARA refuses to list the polar bear as threatened or endangered, even though he is, big time. Why? Because once he's listed as threatened, and once he's listed as endangered, you can't hunt him. And the government does not want to anger the Inuit, who see hunting as a lifeline for them. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But don't list you as endangered. Nope. COSWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSWIC, the guys that make the recommendations for listing, listed the Atlantic bluefin tuna and the white sturgeon as endangered. Not as endangered. Big time. The Canadian government refused to list them at all. Not even special concern, let alone threatened, let alone endangered. Didn't even list them. Fishing communities would be hurt. Human interest. Even the Species at Risk Act was amended in 2012 because in the early version, you couldn't, no industry could intrude into an animal's critical habitat unless it got permission from Environment Canada. They they exempted the National Energy Board from that. In other words, no permission needed to go into critical habitat. So I think, I mentioned first the human interest factor, because it's there. Marine protected areas. This is what BC said. Marine protected areas are public investments. They exist for the benefit of people, for recreation and education. Not for the ecosystems in there. Oh no. People. Always people. And you've only got to read these management plans, which are pretty easy to shred, by the way, to cut apart. They're pretty easy to attack. Can't believe they say what they say. But the human interest factor is always there, not the one. We don't manage for wildlife. We manage wildlife, not for wildlife. So human interest is number one. I suppose all the rest are concomitants of that first one. The second one, how to subjugate it, the pitiful amounts given to wildlife management to do its job. Example, Canadian government, 2015, 16, spent $260 billion. 25 million were allocated to species at risk. That sounds like a lot until you crunch the numbers. That translates into less than 1/100th of 1%. Yep, do a lot with 1/100th of 1% of the budget. Alberta hasn't got a Species at Risk Act. It gives about $25 million to wildlife, fish and wildlife, out of its budget of $42 billion, which again, not just species at risk, but all fish and wildlife, translates into less than 1/10 of 1%. And I'm a little bit wary. I discussed this in the book. I couldn't go all the way because I'm not sure. WTP, willingness to pay. The move now to put a price tag on ecological services and a price tag on endangered animals. And there seems to be trying to assess the value of an endangered species on how much the public is willing to pay for its salvation. And I suppose when you've got an iconic species like a polar bear or a grizzly, you might get a fair amount. But for a rat snake, or a garden life, how much is the public going to be willing to pay for that? So I'm not sure where this is going, guys. I'm not sure where this is going, but I don't like it. In fact, I've already read one article that we should do wildlife, endangered wildlife, and put a triage system on it. Only save the ones that are really important to us. I don't think that's gone anywhere yet. But there's things, I don't know. It's pretty hard to find how this money is being deployed, let alone the focus it gets. And I just wonder, there's this willingness to pay. They survey people and ask you how much you're willing to pay for the salvation. And they base their allocations on that. I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't know where it's going to go, but I don't like it. Explains too why provinces and the federal government support hunting so much. Because it brings in revenues. In fact, some provinces say we couldn't fund our wildlife programs without hunting. I'm not going to go into that one now. That's another one. I discussed that in depth. So the pitiful amounts means that government, I don't think government could do a top job anyway. even if they had a different belief system, they might even get less money. But if they did have a belief system like the one I'm advocating, I don't know how much better they could do. Not with that money. They have to get more. I must admit Trudeau's dishing out a bit more. But again, funding for wildlife lasts as long as a semi-sympathetic government lasts. The third one, I think, is very crucial. I think this is crucial. This labelling of wildlife as a resource. A resource, an exploitive, renewable resource. Wildlife were not mentioned in the Constitution. They're not mentioned in the British North America Act. Instead, they're subsumed as part of the land and placed under provincial control, except in the case of migratory birds and national parks and some marine species. John Livingstone, my hero, the great Canadian naturalist, said that once you label wildlife or anything as a resource, you have to prove its value in the human interest. Now, as a resource, a renewable resource, or as Trudeau said when he's got his family photographed with himself on a Christmas card in 2010 wearing coyote coats, this is sustainable fur. Who cares about the guys that died? This is sustainable fur. But the trouble with wildlife as a resource, it can't compete with the big resources, like logging, like mining, like agriculture. Can't compete. And therefore, in conflict situations involving wildlife habitat and the big players in the resource paradigm, who gets the short end of the stick? Wildlife. Oh yeah. You see it in the boreal forest. You see it in agricultural. Because you can't spend that, if you don't spend that much on a minor resource, which you don't, how in the heck can you do what you want? And once you label something as a resource, then it becomes something for your benefit. Wildlife are not a resource. They are not a renewable resource. They are an aggregate of living beings that share the planet with us. You cannot equate an aggregate of living beings with a truckload of coal, because in the government's eyes, salamander is no different from a sheaf of wheat. Who cares? The salamander dies. Doesn't care. And so, while you apparently, and government believes that they take their low budgetary allowances, combine them with revenues from hunting, which are okay, but they're not that big, and they believe that with that, they can save all species, do everything they want to do, yet still ignore most of wildlife. Because the only species that really count to government are the ones that bring in money. Who are they? Ungulates, predators, wildfowl. They're the ones. And fur-bearing animals. They're the ones. The rest, who cares? Doesn't matter. So that's lopsided. It's wrong. It's non-focused. And a second disadvantage of establishing wildlife as a resource is you don't care about individuals. You manage by species. Individuals don't matter. Individuals count for nothing. As the guy said about the cougar and the cypress hills he destroyed, once you see an animal coming near humans, that's when you have to step in and destroy the animal. Not necessarily, but that's the policy. And when you manage as a species, not as individuals, that introduces a discrete callousness. a discrete insensitivity. We don't see wildlife as kin. We see them as a resource. And if we saw wildlife as kin, we would begin to see we would maybe begin to accept some of the interdependence, but we don't see them. Managing by species introduces a discrete callousness and an insensitivity to wildlife as a whole. And I suppose that would be one of the first things that a government could address. Not take a constitutional amendment, that would be tough. But anyway, it would be worth a try. Next, I want to talk about the way wildlife are managed and the way they use nice terms and use them very discretionally to suit themselves. First, the role of science. Oh, that's a good one. As Wayne McCrory pointed out so beautifully in that article in the folder we had, what's science with the horses? Science in wildlife management is anything but exact. Remember that. I read an article by two prominent biologists who said that if 10 biologists were asked to define a single term in wildlife management, they'd come up with 10 different definitions. So science is never exact. It's also not transparent. With the wild horses, yes, not transparent, coming from government. And certainly so with the grizzly bear in BC. The science has never been transparent. The government just says, this is what science says without producing the evidence. There's also the favoured practice of talking about science and expert opinion. Not by scientists, but by people who know. Usually hunters. Expert opinion. And putting science and expert opinion together. And not telling the public which one they use to reach a certain decision. And next, science is used misleadingly. For example, the cougar management plan in Alberta said that you could hunt cougars and put them down at what you want because they are subject to compensatory mortality, which means that's a density-specific sort of response, which means that when you kill a male cougar, more females come into estrus, more babies are born, and more females survive. Therefore, hunting's okay because they're compensating. A study done exactly on that, on cougars in Washington State, found that in heavily hunted cougar areas, didn't work that way. Cougars migrate so far. Males come in quickly to replace the other males and often kill the kittens to induce estrus in the females. Wrong. Cougars are not big carnivores and do not function that way. They're certainly not cougars. And then there's a spring bear hunt. They're going to use adaptive management. No, sorry, they were going to use science to see whether they could hunt bears in the spring. Didn't work. Didn't work at all because science was never proven. And so the need to use science, doubtful. Environmental historian Stephen Bocking says that generally scientists in the government's employ tend to follow status quo rules. And I read an article on delisting of bears. in the Yellowstone, I think, in the States. And scientists employed by the government were 3 times as much likely to delist the bears, to reduce the protection for them, than were the academics in the universities. So science is used very selectively. It's nowhere near, and governments hide behind it. Governments hide behind it. We used to try out, if you read Macquarie's brief today, look what the government tried to do with the wild horses. Look what they tried to do with their science. Didn't produce anything. Nothing that he could find. And then there's ecological integrity. Oh, the great one. Ecological integrity. Generally, wildlife managers in Canada, they've got a tough job, because how do you measure for ecological integrity? It's pretty tough. It's pretty tough. And any measurement has to take in the human and economic factor as well. That's tough enough. And so you get a baseline concept of what constitutes ecological integrity, even though there's no such thing as a constant in ecological integrity, even though. But you get a fixed idea of what it is. And then, as conditions deviate from that and go down, usually the wildlife are to blame, like there's too many deer, shoot them to restore ecological integrity, which is a subjective determination in the first place. Even the biodiversity strategy said that we are going to renew the ecological integrity in many areas. Back to what? And it was never constant anyway. Ecological integrity is very difficult to measure and almost impossible to manage, because it's always in a changing state. For example, moose in Newfoundland are being destroyed big time, 25,000 a year, because they violate ecological integrity. Yet a study on moose showed that, yes, they do overbrowse, but in doing so they open up canopies of light, which induces more grass cover, which will induce more species to come in, and will take its toll of the moose in the long run naturally. We don't believe that. We say we have to micromanage, when it's almost impossible to micromanage and is subject to too many subjective decisions. And then there's a big one, the flavour of the month, adaptive management. Oh, this is a dilly. Adaptive management. It's supposed to be more nimble. It's supposed to be flexible. And it's supposed to allow wildlife managers to move quickly to address something I think is important, rather than following the regular rules. And it allows them to test for uncertainty. And a lot of wildlife biologists and wildlife people throw their hands up at that. Test for uncertainty. That violates the precautionary principle, which is crucial in wildlife management, which says, if you haven't got all the evidence in, you're going to take a proactive measure, don't do it. Don't do it. Coast Guard, the outfit I mentioned that recommends to Sarah, it follows the precautionary principle. The Biodiversity Convention, the big global outfit that is trying to encourage biodiversity enhancement, it's got the precautionary principle. And the judges on a court case involving the little fish, the Nooksack dace, concluded that the precautionary principle was encoded in the Species of Risk Act. adaptive management cares. So your tests for uncertainty. Now the ongoing wolf cull, where they're culling wolves in BC, shooting them from helicopters, doing all sorts of terrible things to wolves. You know what the Deputy Minister, I know what the Deputy Minister, what a senior member of the BC government said. We're really trying to figure out, does this work? Can you believe it? And then, in BC again, they're killing moose in the Heart Ranges under adaptive management. See what happens to the wolf population, see what happens to the wolves in order to protect caribou. So you make a moose pay the price to test something that you don't know. It would appear to me that the more moose you kill, the more the wolves are going to go after the caribou. So it would have seemed to me, but that's what they're doing. Parks Canada mandate specifically says you only use lethal measures as a last resort. And under adaptive management, so you go out and kill your moose in Rossmore National Park and Cape Breton's Highlands Park. Kill them. You're upsetting ecological integrity. Kill the moose. That should have been your last choice. You should have done other things before that, other interventions, if you want to help ecological integrity in the park. Killing the moose is a last resort. Under adaptive management, let's do it first. And so on. Adaptive management pretty well gives managers what they want to do. Caribou, the endangered woodland caribou, threatened in most of boreal forests, endangered in parts of Alberta and BC. Managers, when an industry moves into previously undisturbed areas, 35% of that has got to be set aside for caribou habitat. And the other 35% can be used for industry, and 65% set aside for caribou habitat. Even though it's admitted that with a 65%, caribou have only got a 40% chance of surviving in the first place, in the 65%. And so, even though the managers have got no idea how many caribou there are, they've got no idea of the caribou threshold for habitat, they're encouraged to make a professional guess to decide what they should do. That's just plain wrong. Adaptive management. Including Croatia and Philippines, 10 countries, and Canada. Guess who came last for cruelty legislation? Canada. So maybe we're not so good in absolving ourselves from cruelty to animals. And the other one, the other moral constraint, the right to a quick and painless death. That's all. That's all we owe animals. And I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. So that's the belief system that figures in government policy. We out here, the body public, we represent a spectrum. I mean, here today, I imagine you're with me and you stand on the side of the animal side. The other side is a non-animal side that says we owe animals nothing. But there is a spectrum in the public. But governments generally represent the broad public opinion and generally represent status quo. And so government's policies represent status quo. So government policies are going to be dead in line with the belief system. And again, before I go into the hows, the belief system says that animals have no self-conscious states. That wild animals have no individual worth for their own sake. And that animals exist for human purposes. Oh, I suppose we could invoke Like if you look at Revenue Canada and you want to get a wildlife charity, and I suppose what do you call it? What was the wild had? The Wild Horse Group. Suppose you got a charitable number. If you did, you had to give Revenue Canada a mission statement that what you did or do will benefit the entire community. So they're not interested in giving you a charitable number because wild horses are important. They're not interested in saying the wild horses, really, that's what it's all about. Now it's about humans being better humans because they like wild horses. It's always human-based. Always human-based. Where did that come from? That being kind to animals makes you a better human? Aquinas, John Locke, Francis Hutchinson, Immanuel Kant, Peter Crothers, and Revenue Canada. All say the same thing. That's enough of the why. I think I've explained it reasonably, because in the book I talk about this. In fact, when I wrote the book first draft, they said, get this philosophy out of management. Gives wildlife management the right to do anything you want to do. Finally, I want to look at the big one in terms of wildlife depletions, the loss of habitat. That's what's doing it. And I admit that wildlife managers and wildlife policy can't do much about that. Although when we look at their protected area strategy, it's rather strange. Canada's protected areas, 70% of them are in the Arctic and the mountain coniferous. 10% of them are in the rich ecosystem zones, and only 5% in the river basin, in the drainage basins. That's not, maybe that's not their fault. But it would be certainly possible that we should be trying more. I think the feds are doing a little bit. They're encouraging conservation easements. For example, I put a conservation easement, or Heather and I put a conservation easement on our land at Pritis. We've got 320 acres, so you can't touch it. Now the feds use that as an example of their protected areas in rich zones like this. So at least they're doing something. But do you know that very, very few protected areas in this country are off limits to hunters, trappers, fishermen, recreational vehicles? Very, very few. Off-road vehicles and the ecosystems that are being disturbed there. Sometimes logging goes on in protected areas, sometimes oil wells, industry infrastructure. And as the BC Marine people said, protected areas are for people. You can't get away from them. The National Parks Act was changed to make ecological integrity the most important point in national park management. Not anymore. With the national parks mandates. It's to do with culture and heritage. Who cares? So I don't think Canadian wildlife are too concerned about their protected areas. Although I did read a cautionary comment that said industry and other activities are increasingly intruding on our protected areas. Only if the public makes a noise and says they value these protected areas will there be any chance of change. That's Environment Canada. Interesting, eh? Interesting. So I can hardly say that our wildlife managers are particularly concerned about the creatures that live in their protected areas. Very few are off limits. Very few. Maybe less than 5%, let's say less than 5%. But the real damage is being done by industry in three forms. Into the boreal forest, that magnificent regime, billions of birds, richest in taxonomy, all sorts of creatures, 91 million hectares. And we're moving in there, the forestry's moving in there. And who knows when it's going to stop. Steadily moving north. Steadily moving north. In agricultural areas, agriculture generally is hostile to wildlife. Best land for wildlife is unimproved land. But that's not the main issue. The main issue are the contaminants. The GMO crops, the stuff you pour into the soil, the stuff is doing all sorts of damage to subsurface organisms, to birds, polluting the wetlands. Wetlands down 75% in the last 50 years. 75% gone. Contaminants, and then the intrusion by oil and gas industries and mining. With that relative disregard for habitat. It's accidental. No one wants a stage grouse to go, but if they can't coexist with industry, tough luck stage grouse. We'd like to bring the black-footed ferret back, but the trouble is they need the black-tailed prairie dog. And farmers and ranchers don't like them. And the ranchers that are on community farms, community pastures, don't like them either. Government, community pastures. So you can't introduce the black-footed ferret back because you can't introduce the black-tailed prairie dog back because they're both interdependent. No habitat. No habitat. And the same applies to lots of creatures facing extinction. But it's not in the mindset, it's not in the belief system to say the boreal chickadee is more important than that forest, than that tree to cut down. No one says that. That's not right. Or that the cow's larkspur is more important than the ranching. Won't allow it. You see what I mean? That's what I'm trying to say. The belief system won't allow it. No. It'll make some modifications, but it won't allow the sort of paradigmatic change that I think we need. The way forward, according to the government, is sustainability. Oh, I've heard that word once, I've heard it a million times. I said, gee, my poor classes at the university used to hear this, and jumping up and down. I'm being quite calm here now, but usually I pace. I jump up and down, screaming, raise my hand, and do all sorts of histrionics. And nothing brings it on more than sustainability. Which assumes restraint, wants restraint, and assumes a benign human presence among wildlife and habitat. Come on. As John Livingston said, sustainability is just an excuse to plunder nature and get away with it. I agree with you. But that's the order of the day. Sustainability. Even that big report that opened up this book, the World Wildlife Fund, said we are going down the road really badly. Did it ever question the belief system? It just said, let's be more cautious. Let's try harder. With the money to be made by exploiting habitat? No. I don't see it. Sustainability won't do. Stewardship won't do. We might have stewardship, not me, but you guys might have stewardship. Conscious of what constitutes stewardship. But that's one of the problems of the Species at Risk Act. Because the Species at Risk Act presupposes most of what's happening is on private land. And the government can't control what happens on private land too well. So they encourage stewardship. And most farmers and ranchers are okay along with that, if they get some compensation, and some don't even care anyway. So it depends on to whom you're talking when you come to stewardship. I said in my conclusion, I don't see much hope. Wildlife have always been outliers. They typify the beast, the brutes, the dumb animals, the fierce, the savage. The "we are not animals" idea refers to them. The beast within us refers to them. Wildlife have never been high in priorities, never. Domesticated animals have got their problems too, but at least with them, we can identify with them. They're our friends, not wildlife. Pretty hard to bond with, pretty hard to empathise with, but it has to be, in my opinion. So I saw there was no hope. And then my editor said, "Max, you can't do this." And I said, "No, I know, I've got a deterministic argument. I know my argument is determinist. I know that. Got to give some hope." So I said, okay. I said, if I was forced to give some hope, I would do 4 things. First of all, I would try to cultivate in young children the idea that we owe animals things morally. We owe them the same moral treatment in many ways as we give to each other. That's what I try to do for education. I try to talk government into lifting the resource definition and replace it with a trust or an obligation. It would take a constitutional amendment. Tough to do. Provinces would have to give up a lot. Tough to do. But if there was some other giveaways to provinces, maybe it could be done. And if wildlife were a trust, and people have said to me, "Okay, Max, wildlife's a trust, what does that mean?" And I say, "I don't know." Not really. And they say, "You don't know?" The way you bloody well suggested it for. I said, because anything's better than what we've got now. It would force us to think differently. It would force us to go to the table and come up with some policies that made sense. That's the second thing I do. And third, I try to get the message out that those guys out there are autonomous nations, other nations, speaking in their own ways, as Henry Beston said. They are not underlings. They are not our brethren. They are other nations, caught in the web and travail of life and time. And he's dead on. The only thing I've ever written, I've read. Anything I've ever read that I wish I'd written was that quote. And I think we recognise them as autonomous. They don't need us. Yeah, they're a bit opportunistic, but so are a lot of people. Yeah, they're going to do some not so good things sometimes. Not with ill intent, but because they're who they are. But that's the way it goes. Live with it. They are autonomous, other nations. Imagine that's a step for government to reach. But if we had the power of the people, people like you guys, all the outfits that are out there, all the animal advocacy groups, all working out there, the Robs of the world, the Julies of the world, working out there all the time, tirelessly. If you could get a critical mass demanding change, maybe a newly elected government might say, "Whoa, let's talk about this. Let's start a serious conversation." I can live with that. And finally, I would like people to use the quality that they think they have that makes them way better than animals. The faculty of reason. Stand back from the rationalisations, which I define rationalisations as getting answers that are compatible with your belief system anyway. Stand aside and look outside your own rationalisations, and what do you see? You see beings out there who are caught in the problems and travails of negotiating their own environment, of birthing and living, trying to get by, enjoying the sun, surviving the cold, playing together, developing their own social arrangements, talking in the trees, chattering away to each other. Not carrying out lifestyle practices that are like our own. Different but like our own. And say, like me, they want to live. Like me, they have the right to live. I don't have to love them. Heather loved wildlife. Loved them. Not me so much. I just employ what I call rational empathy. The quality of rational empathy. I can empathise with them out there. Don't have to love them. I can empathise with them. I get it, mate. I get it. They're as much right to this bloody planet as I have. And if we do some of those things, maybe we'll nudge the belief system. And maybe you guys are already. Because I think a lot of people subconsciously hold a position on animals that's way close to the despised animal rights position that they think. A lot of people, I know, my good friends, would never call themselves animal rights. By gee, they're close. They're close and they don't know it. I'm not advocating for that. I'm simply advocating for relief from the status of resource, recognition of their autonomy, a position of rational empathy which accepts the right to live, and above all, a recognition that animals are moral beings. Thanks for being a top audience. I don't know whether you got it. It's all in the book. Thanks a lot.